Thank you for watching this video on measuring performance with Vena solutions. So I recently had to look back at some work I did a while ago to try and tune it to make it faster. This is a solution where the templates are all working, the reports are correct, calculations are working. It's just a bit slow. So maybe you have a similar situation where the current state is, the solution is calculating values correctly, all the templates are correct, but saves are slow and loading files are slow. Loading files. I guess loading files is slow. So how do we test performance without access to fancy tools? Sure, there's lots of different tools available that are focused around testing to simulate a large number of users hitting a system at the same time. Now, if you don't have access to those kind of tools, you can still have a proxy for that same kind of test for simulating a large number of users. So that's what I'll talk about today. So first thing we need to do is we need to identify the key intersections that trigger calculations. So maybe you're saving back some values which then are translated to different currencies, or there's an allocation that happens, or there's there could be any number of calculations that take the number that's saved, and then from that number, a bunch of expenses need to be recalculated, or revenue needs to be driven. But identifying what are the numbers that you need to save that trigger those kind of calculations. Now, once you can do that, you can build a template for testing to save to those intersections with multiple combinations. So I'll explain that a little bit when we look at the template. But generally, each time you save, we're simulating that number of users saving at the same time. Now, I should say there are a couple exceptions to this approach. There is additional overhead for each user that we cannot account for with this method. So you can't think that this is exactly how many users, this is the performance that if you're looking at 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 users, this is not going to be the exact performance that they would see. But I do argue that it's a good proxy for it. And that's because the trend of the experiments and comparisons are valid, but the exact timings may differ from the same number of separate users saving at the same time. And by this, I mean, we're going to simulate using one template as one user hitting save, but I'm saving to 5, 10, 100, 1,000, 5,000 intersections that would be equivalent to having those same number of users in each separately saving to really their own set of intersections. So let me kind of show you the template, and I'll explain a bit more. So here we are, we're looking at it. I've designed a template here that has a bunch of input columns to show me where we may or may not have data already loaded into the system. Here I've identified there's 3 key cells that a number gets saved back to, and from that, a number of things get calculated. Now, you won't see any numbers here. I'm trying to respect privacy here, so this is all just test data. But the idea being, one user would typically run a template. Now, this is not the template they would normally interact with, but in the template they would normally interact with, they would pick one cost center and one market. So it'd be one combination of those two. They'd put in their estimations, and they would end up saving those 3 cells. So that's one user. So all we're doing is we're saying, well, if one user is going to pick a cost center, pick a market, and enter some numbers, what if we expand that to say that there's a large number of cost center and market combinations with a large number, with each one of those saving a number to that intersection? And it turns out by using this approach, we can start looking at some results. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look at a baseline. So I would say, hey, what does it look like if you're saving 1, saving 10, saving 50, saving 100? You're going to get to a point where it errors out. Typically, that's around the 10-minute mark. Sometimes even when you see an error message, it can be successful, but seeing an error message in my mind is a failure of a performance test. So take a baseline first to let you know what you're starting with, and then start making subtle changes. So I've tried a number of different things here. Now, just to share some of the findings I've uncovered, it's important to reduce the span of allocations. So if you're allocating a number You've got, someone saves the number 1,000, and then you allocate over 12 months or 3 years, or 100 different cost centers, or whatever it may be. The smaller the span of that allocation, the faster the save will be, because that allocation, if it's done in a calculation, needs to happen after each save. And I looked at because I'm trying to provide suggestions, I'm looking at this as the impact of them, impact of different options. But yeah, reducing the span of an allocation was quite good. Also the ordering. So the largest 2 dimensions should be at the first and second dimension. I've uncovered that Vena has indices applied such that there's a forward index that starts at the first dimension, goes forward. There's also a reverse index that starts at the last dimension and goes back. But if you can set your dimensions up so that the first 2 or even 3 dimensions are the largest, the first one being the largest, then second largest and third largest, as long as those are the first 3 dimensions, you'll get much better performance than if you were just trying to, if they were somewhere in the middle of your list of dimensions. But what it is for each of these different combinations, I would say, what if I'm saving What if I'm saving 1 user, 10 users, 50 users, all the way up to 5,000? There's sections that will error out. It won't be able to work. But then by looking at a smaller set, for reducing some of my large dimensions, or moving those to the first and second dimension in my my model, I should be able to get a large number of users into the system. So to recap, if you're trying to measure performance and you don't have access to fancy test tools, now the solution should already be at a point where values are correct, templates and reports are all correct, but saves are slow, loading files is slow, and you're just trying to wonder, how do I measure performance? And this is the reason measurement is important. Is you want to say, well, if I were to do some change, will that improve? Will it improve my situation, stay the same, or get worse? Because those are all possibilities. So first, we identify the key intersections that trigger the calculation, build a template for testing to save to those intersections with multiple combinations. And the multiple combinations is important because each combination should represent, one user saving on whatever your main template is. And then each time you save, we're simulating that number of users saving at the same time. Now let me kind of go back to this one for a moment. If I'm looking at my template, if I were to just change one number, and I save that for those 3 things, when I come here and make sure I'm in edit data mode and I click save, because I've only changed 1 row, I'm simulating the 1 user saving at the same time. So now that extrapolates further. So here I've got 1 row of data. What if I just fill that down for 10 rows? So now I've changed 10 rows of data. If I were to hit save now, I'm simulating 10 users all saving at the same time. If I go even further down, now I'd be simulating 20 users. When I hit save, I'd be simulating 20 users all saving data at the same time in the system. And what I'll expect to see is if I run those tests consecutively, I'll start to see a trend. First save will be probably the fastest. 10 will be a little bit slower, 20 will be a little bit slower, so on and so forth, until you kind of get to an upper bound. And then once you have your baseline, as a comparison to that baseline, and also as a trend across the number of users, you'll be able to start seeing a pattern of which performance changes will help what you're trying to do. And just to recap the exception, so there's also additional overhead that for each user that we cannot account for with this method. The trend of the experiments and comparisons are valid, but the exact timings may differ from the same number of separate users saving at the same time. And this is where the fancy simulation tools can help. they can actually simulate an entirely different session, hitting the system, logging in, running data, doing all the different pieces of it. But this is meant to be just a method, more of a workaround to say, hey, everything's working, but you want to make it faster. How do you start testing that to measure that performance? Thanks for watching. I hope this was a helpful video.